The morning sun had barely risen over Pine Street when Officer James Sullivan pulled his patrol car to the side of the road. His cold coffee sat forgotten in the cup holder as his eyes narrowed on the expensive-looking black sedan that had just rolled through a stop sign. After 5 years on the force, Sullivan took pride in never letting any violation slip by, no matter how small. Dispatch, this is Officer Sullivan. I'm initiating a traffic stop on a black Mercedes-Benz, license plate Charlie Alpha Mike 4859, at the corner of Pine and Wilson. He spoke into his radio, already flicking on his lights. The Mercedes took its time pulling over, which only added to Sullivan's irritation. He watched as it finally came to a stop, noting how it was parked perfectly parallel to the curb. Running a quick check on the license plate, everything came back clean. The car belonged to a Margaret Thompson. Sullivan adjusted his badge and utility belt before stepping out of his patrol car. The morning air was crisp, and somewhere in the distance, a dog was barking. As he approached the vehicle, he noticed the dark-tinted windows rolling down, revealing an elderly black woman in the driver's seat. She wore a simple blue sweater and had silver-rimmed glasses perched on her nose. "License and registration, ma'am," Sullivan said firmly, his hand resting casually on his belt near his flashlight. It was a habit he'd developed over the years, one that made him feel more in control of every situation. "Officer, I apologize for the stop sign, but I'm running terribly late for a very important meeting," Margaret Thompson said, her voice calm but carrying a note of urgency. She was already reaching for her purse, movements deliberate and slow. Sullivan's jaw tightened. He'd heard every excuse in the book, and this one wasn't going to work either. "The law applies to everyone, ma'am. License and registration, please." As she handed over her documents, Sullivan noticed her hands were steady, her nails perfectly manicured. She didn't seem nervous like most people did during traffic stops. If anything, she appeared mildly annoyed, which somehow bothered him more than it should have. "Do you know why I pulled you over today?" Sullivan asked, following his usual script. "Yes, Officer Sullivan," she replied, reading his name tag. "I didn't come to a complete stop at the sign back there. As I mentioned, I'm running late for a crucial meeting, and I'd be more than happy to accept a warning." "Ma'am," Sullivan cut her off. "Running a stop sign is a serious violation that puts other drivers and pedestrians at risk." He glanced at her license. Margaret Thompson, 65 years old, living in the expensive part of town. His gut told him she was probably used to talking her way out of tickets. "Officer, I understand your position," Margaret said, her tone shifting to something more professional. "However, I believe we could handle this more efficiently with a warning. I have an appointment that affects the entire city, and I'm already running behind schedule." Sullivan felt his patience wearing thin. In his experience, people who lived in big houses with expensive cars often thought they were above the law. "Step out of the vehicle, please." "Excuse me?" Margaret's eyebrows rose above her glasses. "Is that really necessary for a minor traffic violation?" "Ma'am, when an officer gives you a lawful order, you need to comply," Sullivan stated, his voice getting harder. He noticed a couple of neighbors had come out onto their porches, watching the scene unfold. Some had their phones out, but he didn't care. He was doing his job by the book. "Young man," Margaret said, still making no move to exit her car, "I suggest you think very carefully about your next action. I'm happy to accept a ticket if you feel it's necessary, but this escalation is unwarranted." Sullivan felt his face grow hot. He'd dealt with plenty of difficult people before, but something about this woman's calm defiance made him want to assert his authority even more. Little did he know, his next decision would change the course of his entire career. "Last time, ma'am. Step out of the vehicle, or I'll have to place you under arrest for failing to comply with a police officer's orders." Margaret Thompson took a deep breath, her hands still resting calmly on the steering wheel. The morning sun cast long shadows across her face as she looked directly at Officer Sullivan. "If you insist on this course of action, I'll need to call my lawyer first." Sullivan's face hardened. In his mind, mentioning a lawyer was always a sign of guilt or defiance. "Ma'am, exit the vehicle now. Calling your lawyer can wait until after we've handled this situation." By now, a small crowd had gathered on the sidewalk. Mrs. Jenkins from number 42 was recording everything on her phone, while her husband frantically typed something on his own device. Two joggers had stopped their morning run to watch, and a delivery truck slowed down as it passed by. "Very well," Margaret said, reaching for her door handle. Her movements were careful and measured, exactly as she'd always taught others to behave during police encounters. The irony of her current situation wasn't lost on her. As she stepped out, Margaret's knee buckled slightly, an old injury acting up again. Sullivan immediately grabbed her arm, interpreting her unsteady movement as resistance. "Stop resisting," he commanded, though Margaret hadn't done anything but try to regain her balance. "Officer, I'm not resisting. I have a bad knee, and if you just—" Margaret's calm explanation was cut short as Sullivan twisted her arm behind her back. The crowd gasped, and more phones came out to record the scene. "You're under arrest for disorderly conduct and resisting arrest," Sullivan announced, reaching for his handcuffs. His training kicked in automatically, drowning out the murmurs of disapproval from the growing audience. Margaret winced as the cold metal clasped around her wrists. "Officer Sullivan, badge number 4479, she said loudly and clearly, making sure the recording bystanders could hear. "I want it noted that I have complied with all your commands, and this arrest is completely unwarranted." Mrs. Jenkins stepped forward, her phone still recording. "This is absolutely ridiculous. She's just an elderly woman who ran a stop sign." "Ma'am." "Step back," Sullivan ordered, his voice rising. "This is a police matter." As he led Margaret to his patrol car, she remained surprisingly composed. "I assume you're taking me to the central station?" she asked, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "Yes, ma'am," Sullivan replied stiffly, helping her into the back seat with mechanical professionalism. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about this woman's calm demeanor, but he pushed the thought aside. He dealt with plenty of entitled people before who thought they were above the law. The drive to the station was quiet, but Margaret spent it memorizing every detail. The time on the car's dashboard read 8:47 a.m. She was now officially late for her 9 o'clock a.m. appointment. The irony of the situation almost made her smile, despite the discomfort of the handcuffs. At the station, Sullivan led Margaret through the front entrance, past the desk sergeant whose coffee cup clattered loudly against his desk when he saw her. A young officer nearby dropped his entire stack of papers, but Sullivan didn't notice their strange reactions. "I need to process this arrest," Sullivan announced to the booking officer, who stared at Margaret with wide eyes. Stop sign violation escalated to disorderly conduct and resisting arrest. The booking officer, a veteran named Rodriguez, stood up slowly. "Officer Sullivan," he said carefully, "I think there's something you should." Just then, the door to the chief's office burst open. Chief Williams rushed out, his face a mix of shock and horror. "Oh my God," he muttered, quickly approaching them. "Commissioner Thompson, I am so sorry about this misunderstanding." Sullivan's hand, still holding Margaret's arm, went slack. His face drained of color as the chief's words sank in. "Commissioner Thompson? The new police commissioner they've been preparing for all week?" Margaret Thompson straightened her shoulders as much as the handcuffs would allow. "Chief Williams," she said calmly, though there was steel in her voice. "I believe Officer Sullivan here has given us the perfect example of why I was hired for this position in the first place. Now, would someone please remove these handcuffs? We have a lot to discuss." Margaret Thompson took a deep breath, her hands still resting calmly on the steering wheel. The morning sun cast long shadows across her face as she looked directly at Officer Sullivan. "If you insist on this course of action, I'll need to call my lawyer first." Sullivan's face hardened. In his mind, mentioning a lawyer was always a sign of guilt or defiance. "Ma'am, exit the vehicle now. Calling your lawyer can wait until after we've handled this situation." By now, a small crowd had gathered on the sidewalk. Mrs. Jenkins from number 42 was recording everything on her phone, while her husband frantically typed something on his own device. Two joggers had stopped their morning run to watch, and a delivery truck slowed down as it passed by. "Very well," Margaret said, reaching for her door handle. Her movements were careful and measured, exactly as she'd always taught others to behave during police encounters. The irony of her current situation wasn't lost on her. As she stepped out, Margaret's knee buckled slightly, an old injury acting up again. Sullivan immediately grabbed her arm, interpreting her unsteady movement as resistance. "Stop resisting," he commanded, though Margaret hadn't done anything but try to regain her balance. "Officer, I'm not resisting. I have a bad knee, and if you just..." Margaret's calm explanation was cut short as Sullivan twisted her arm behind her back. The crowd gasped, and more phones came out to record the scene. "You're under arrest for disorderly conduct and resisting arrest," Sullivan announced, reaching for his handcuffs. His training kicked in automatically, drowning out the murmurs of disapproval from the growing audience. Margaret winced as the cold metal clasped around her wrists. "Officer Sullivan, badge number 4479. She said loudly and clearly, making sure the recording bystanders could hear. "I want it noted that I have complied with all your commands, and this arrest is completely unwarranted." Mrs. Jenkins stepped forward, her phone still recording. "This is absolutely ridiculous. She's just an elderly woman who ran a stop sign." "Ma'am, step back," Sullivan ordered, his voice rising. "This is a police matter." As he led Margaret to his patrol car, she remained surprisingly composed. "I assume you're taking me to the central station?" she asked, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "Yes, ma'am," Sullivan replied stiffly, helping her into the back seat with mechanical professionalism. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about this woman's calm demeanor, but he pushed the thought aside. He'd dealt with plenty of entitled people before who thought they were above the law. The drive to the station was quiet, but Margaret spent it memorizing every detail. The time on the car's dashboard read 8:47 a.m. She was now officially late for her 9 a.m. appointment. The irony of the situation almost made her smile, despite the discomfort of the handcuffs. At the station, Sullivan led Margaret through the front entrance, past the desk sergeant whose coffee cup clattered loudly against his desk when he saw her. A young officer nearby dropped his entire stack of papers, but Sullivan didn't notice their strange reactions. "I need to process this arrest," Sullivan announced to the booking officer, who stared at Margaret with wide eyes. Stop sign violation escalated to disorderly conduct and resisting arrest. The booking officer, a veteran named Rodriguez, stood up slowly. "Officer Sullivan," he said carefully, "I think there's something you should." Just then, the door to the chief's office burst open. Chief Williams rushed out, his face a mix of shock and horror. "Oh my God," he muttered, quickly approaching them. "Commissioner Thompson, I am so sorry about this misunderstanding." Sullivan's hand, still holding Margaret's arm, went slack. His face drained of color as the chief's words sank in. "Commissioner Thompson?" The new police commissioner they'd been preparing for all week. Margaret Thompson straightened her shoulders as much as the handcuffs would allow. "Chief Williams," she said calmly, though there was steel in her voice. "I believe Officer Sullivan here has given us the perfect example of why I was hired for this position in the first place. Now, would someone please remove these handcuffs? We have a lot to discuss." Officer James Sullivan sat alone in the break room, staring at his phone. The news was everywhere. Every local channel, every news website, and all over social media. "New police commissioner arrested by own officer on first day." Some headlines were worse. "Racial profiling. Commissioner's arrest raises questions about police conduct." His hands shook as he picked up his coffee cup, now cold and bitter like his thoughts. The suspension notice lay on the table in front of him. 2 weeks, pending investigation. It felt like a lifetime. "Sullivan," a voice called from the doorway. It was Officer Martinez, his partner for the last 3 years. "Chief wants you to clear out your desk. They're starting the investigation tomorrow." Sullivan nodded silently. Just yesterday, Martinez would have sat down with him, maybe even cracked a joke to lighten the mood. Now, his partner just turned and walked away, leaving Sullivan alone again. At his desk, Sullivan began emptying his drawers. 5 years of work reduced to a small cardboard box. As he reached for his nameplate, his computer screen caught his eye. It was open to Commissioner Thompson's personnel file, the one he should have read during last week's briefing about the new commissioner. His eyes widened as he read. Margaret Thompson wasn't just any police commissioner. She had graduated top of her class from the FBI Academy, led major civil rights investigations, and won numerous cases against police departments for discrimination. She had quite literally written the book on modern policing and community relations, a book that was probably sitting unread on his own shelf at home. Quite a read, isn't it? Sullivan jumped at the voice. Sergeant Rodriguez stood behind him, arms crossed. The older officer had always been kind to Sullivan, mentoring him through his early days on the force. "I really messed up, didn't I, Sarge?" Sullivan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Rodriguez pulled up a chair. "You know what the worst part is, kid? She's exactly who we need right now. Look at this." He pointed to another article on the screen. Commissioner Thompson's last position was fixing a department in California. You know what she did? Instead of firing officers who showed bias, she reformed them, created one of the most successful rehabilitation programs in the country. Sullivan's throat felt tight, and I arrested her before she even started her first day. "The media's having a field day," Rodriguez continued, pulling out his phone. "Social media's blowing up. That video of the arrest, over 1 million views already. Your name's trending, and not in a good way." Out in the office, Sullivan could see other officers huddled around their computers, probably watching the same videos, reading the same articles. None of them would meet his eyes. "What happens now?" Sullivan asked, putting the last of his belongings in the box. "Now?" Rodriguez stood up. "Now you go home and wait. The commissioner's giving a press conference in an hour. After that, who knows? But kid," he paused, placing a hand on Sullivan's shoulder, "whatever happens, take it as a learning experience." As Sullivan walked through the station, he felt the weight of every stare, heard every whispered comment. Officers who used to greet him warmly now turned away. At the front desk, even old Jerry, who'd been there forever and was friendly to everyone, suddenly became very busy with his paperwork. Outside, reporters were still camped in the parking lot. Sullivan clutched his box tighter and took the back exit, slipping out like a thief in the night. The irony wasn't lost on him. Just this morning, he walked in through the front door, confident and proud, never imagining how quickly his world could turn upside down. In his car, Sullivan sat for a long moment, staring at the building where he worked for 5 years. His radio crackled with the daily chatter, but for the first time he wasn't part of it. As he started the engine, he caught a glimpse of Commissioner Thompson through a window, preparing for her press conference. She stood tall and dignified, showing no signs of the morning's ordeal. "I'm sorry," he whispered to no one in particular, then pulled out of the parking lot, leaving behind everything he worked for, wondering if he ever wear the badge again. 1 week into his suspension, Officer Sullivan sat nervously in the department's conference room. The large space felt surprisingly small with just him, Commissioner Thompson, and 2 internal affairs investigators present. The wall-mounted TV played a series of dashcam videos, all traffic stops Sullivan had made over the past year. "Officer Sullivan," Commissioner Thompson said, posing one video, "would you explain your actions in this stop from 3 months ago?" On screen, Sullivan was asking a young black man to step out of his car during what should have been a routine speeding ticket. The man had been polite, showing his license and registration immediately. Sullivan started, then stopped. Watching himself on video was like seeing a stranger. "I thought he was reaching for something under his seat." "Was he?" Commissioner Thompson asked quietly. "No, ma'am. He was adjusting his seat belt." The next video showed a similar scene, this time with an elderly Hispanic woman, then another with a black teenager. Each stop had escalated beyond what was necessary. Sullivan felt sick to his stomach as he watched pattern after pattern of his own bias play out on screen. Commissioner Thompson turned to the investigators. "Gentlemen, could you give us the room?" After they left, she opened a thick folder on the table. "In 5 years, Officer Sullivan, you've made 847 traffic stops. Would you care to guess the racial breakdown of those stops?" Sullivan's mouth went dry. He'd never thought to check. 68% were people of color, she continued, in a district that's only 30% non-white. She slid some papers across the table. "But here's what's interesting. Your actual citation rate was fairly consistent across all races. Do you know what that suggests?" "That I was stopping more minorities but not finding more violations," Sullivan admitted, the realization hitting him hard. "Exactly." Commissioner Thompson stood up and walked to the window. Outside, protesters still gathered daily, holding signs with Sullivan's name and face. "You're not a bad officer, Sullivan. Your record shows multiple commendations for bravery. Your fellow officers speak highly of your dedication. But like many others, you've developed certain patterns." She turned back to face him. "Tell me, since your suspension, What have you been doing? Sullivan shifted in his chair. Honestly, I've been watching those videos of my stops over and over. I've been reading about implicit bias. I've been trying to understand. Good, she interrupted. That's exactly what I wanted to hear. She pressed a button on the remote, and a new video played. The dashcam footage from her own arrest. Watch this again. Tell me what you see. Sullivan forced himself to watch. He saw himself getting aggressive with an older woman who had done nothing to warrant it. He saw himself escalating a simple traffic stop into an arrest. Most importantly, he saw his own face, filled with an authority he hadn't earned and anger he couldn't justify. Commissioner, he said, his voice shaking slightly, I know saying sorry isn't enough. What I did was wrong, not just with you, but with many others. I understand if you need to fire me. Commissioner Thompson sat back down, studying him carefully. Fire you? No, Officer Sullivan. That would be the easy way out, for both of us. She pulled out another folder. I have a different plan in mind. You see, when I took this job, I promised to change this department's culture. To do that, I need officers who understand firsthand why change is necessary. She opened the folder, revealing a detailed program outline. This is a 6-month rehabilitation and retraining program I've developed. Community outreach, bias training, cultural competency workshops. It's intensive, and it's not optional if you want to keep your badge. Sullivan leaned forward, looking at the program details. It would be challenging, possibly humiliating, and definitely uncomfortable. But as he looked at the protest signs outside and thought about all those traffic stops, he knew he had a choice to make. When do I start? He asked. The community center buzzed with activity as Officer Sullivan walked in, dressed in civilian clothes. It had been a month since his meeting with Commissioner Thompson, and this was part of his rehabilitation program, spending time with the communities he had policed. You must be Officer Sullivan, said Marcus Washington, a tall man in his 60s who ran the center. There was no warmth in his voice, just careful observation. Commissioner Thompson said you'd be joining us. Sullivan nodded, trying not to fidget. The walls were covered with photos of community events, including several showing tense encounters between police and local residents. He recognized some of the locations. He'd been at a few of those incidents himself. Today's youth program, Marcus explained, leading him through the building. We have teenagers here who've had, let's say, interesting experiences with law enforcement. The classroom was filled with about 20 teenagers, all from minority communities. As Sullivan walked in, the room went silent. A few of the kids recognized him from the viral video of Commissioner Thompson's arrest. This is James, Marcus announced to the group. He's here to listen to your stories. A young man in the back raised his hand. Ain't you the cop who arrested the commissioner? His tone was more curious than hostile. Yes, Sullivan admitted, his face growing hot. That's why I'm here, to learn from my mistakes. Over the next 2 hours, Sullivan listened as teenager after teenager shared their experiences with police. 16-year-old Michael described being stopped 3 times in 1 week walking home from basketball practice. Maria, a quiet girl with bright eyes, talked about watching her father being handcuffed during a routine traffic stop, just like Commissioner Thompson. You know what the worst part is? Said Jamal, a senior in high school. It's not the stops themselves. It's the fear. Every time I see those lights in my rearview mirror, I wonder if this is the day something goes wrong. Sullivan thought about all the traffic stops he'd made, how many times he'd approached cars with his hand near his weapon, assuming the worst. He never considered how that looked from the other side. Later that week, Commissioner Thompson had him ride along with Officer Sarah Chen, one of the department's most successful community policing officers. Chen's approach to patrol was completely different from what Sullivan was used to. Hey, Mrs. Rodriguez. Chen called out to an elderly woman sweeping her storefront. How's your grandson doing in college? Sarah, he's doing great. Want to see pictures? Sullivan watched as Chen spent 5 minutes looking at photos and chatting. Throughout the day, he saw her do this again and again, talking to shop owners, playing basketball with kids during her break, knowing everyone's names and stories. This is real police work, Chen explained during lunch. When you know your community, when they trust you, they help you keep the peace. It's not us versus them. The hardest part came 2 weeks later, when Sullivan had to attend a community meeting about police reform. Commissioner Thompson was there, watching from the back as he stood at the podium. "My name is James Sullivan," he began, his voice shaking slightly. "A month ago, I wrongfully arrested Commissioner Thompson. That wasn't my first mistake. For years, I've been part of a bigger problem." He looked out at the faces in the crowd, some angry, some skeptical, some hopeful. "I can't change what I've done, but I can change what I do from here on out. I'm here to listen, to learn, and to do better." After the meeting, an older black woman approached him. She reminded him of Commissioner Thompson, and for a moment, he tensed up. But she simply patted his arm. "It takes courage to admit when you're wrong," she said. "Just make sure your actions match your words." That night, Sullivan sat in his car for a long time, thinking about everything he'd learned. His phone buzzed with a message from Commissioner Thompson. "Progress report meeting tomorrow. Bring your community feedback forms." He smiled slightly. It wasn't going to be easy, but for the first time since the arrest, he felt like he was on the right path. 3 months into his rehabilitation program, Officer Sullivan stood in front of Commissioner Thompson's office, weekly progress report in hand. The past 12 weeks had changed him in ways he never expected. His uniform, which he was finally allowed to wear again, felt different on his shoulders, less like armor and more like a symbol of responsibility. "Come in, Officer Sullivan," Commissioner Thompson called out. She was reviewing a stack of community feedback forms, all bearing his name. "Please have a seat." Sullivan sat down, noticing the changes in the office since his first terrifying meeting here. Now there were photos on the walls, community events, graduation ceremonies, and one particular picture that caught his eye. Commissioner Thompson as a rookie officer, 30 years ago. "Tell me about Mrs. Chen's situation," Commissioner Thompson said, not looking up from her papers. "Her grandson was caught tagging the side of the mini-mart," Sullivan began. "Before the program, I would have arrested him immediately. Instead, I remembered what Officer Chen taught me. I talked to Mrs. Chen and her grandson. Turns out he's a talented artist, just using his skills in the wrong way." "And?" Commissioner Thompson prompted, finally looking up. "And now he's helping design a community mural on that same wall." The mini-mart owner agreed to sponsor the project. Sullivan couldn't help but smile. A whole neighborhood's getting involved. Commissioner Thompson nodded, pulling out another file. "I've been monitoring your traffic stops since you returned to active duty. Notice anything different?" Sullivan looked at the statistics. His stop rates now matched the district's demographics almost perfectly. More importantly, his interaction ratings from civilians had improved dramatically. "I take more time now," he explained. "Listen more, assume less. Like that stop last week, the young man with the broken taillight. Before, I might have seen his nervousness as suspicious. Now I understand it better." "Yes, about that stop." Commissioner Thompson pulled out a letter. "The young man's father wrote to me. Said you not only gave his son a warning, but helped him change the taillight right there on the spot. Called it the most positive interaction with police his family had ever had." Sullivan felt his chest tighten with emotion. The father and son had reminded him of so many stops he handled differently in the past. "Commissioner," he said, his voice serious, "I need to tell you something. That morning, when I pulled you over, I thought about it every day, how differently I would handle it now." Commissioner Thompson leaned back in her chair. "Tell me, if that same situation happened today, what would you do?" "First, I'd approach with respect, not suspicion. I'd listen when you explained about the meeting. Even if I still gave you a ticket, there was no reason for the situation to escalate. My ego got in the way of my judgment. And that's exactly why I didn't fire you," Commissioner Thompson said, standing up to look out her window. "Any officer can learn procedures. The hard part is learning to see past our own biases, to recognize when we're letting power override judgment." She turned back to face him. "You're not the same officer who arrested me 3 months ago, Sullivan. Your fellow officers have noticed. The community has noticed. But more importantly, you've noticed." Walking to a cabinet, she pulled out a familiar-looking folder, the same one from their first meeting. "The rehabilitation program was designed to last 6 months. However, based on your progress, I have a different proposal." She handed him the folder. Inside was a new assignment: Community Relations Training Officer. "You've lived both sides of this issue now," she explained. You understand the problems because you were part of them, and you understand the solutions because you've worked for them. I want you to help train other officers, share your experience. Sullivan stared at the assignment, overwhelmed. You want me to help train others? After what I did? Precisely because of what you did, and because of what you've done since then. Commissioner Thompson smiled for the first time. Sometimes the best teachers are the ones who had to learn the hardest lessons themselves. 6 months to the day after his fateful traffic stop, Officer James Sullivan stood at the podium in the Police Academy auditorium. The room was packed with new recruits, veteran officers, community leaders, and media representatives. In the front row sat Marcus Washington from the community center, Officer Chen, and several teenagers from his youth program. Commissioner Thompson watched from the side of the stage, a subtle smile on her face. When I started my career 6 years ago, Sullivan began, his voice steady and clear. I thought I knew everything about being a good police officer. Follow procedures, maintain authority, and control every situation. I was wrong. He gestured to the screen behind him, where his dashcam footage of Commissioner Thompson's arrest began to play. Several people in the audience shifted uncomfortably. This video went viral 6 months ago. Many of you probably watched it and thought, I would never do that. That's exactly what I used to think when I watched similar videos. But bias doesn't announce itself. It whispers in your ear, making you see threats that aren't there, making you escalate situations that don't need escalating. Sullivan clicked to the next slide, showing photos from his community service work. These past 6 months have taught me what real police work looks like. It's not about power or control. It's about service. It's about understanding that every person we interact with is someone's parent, child, or friend. In the audience, he spotted Mrs. Jenkins, the neighbor who had recorded his arrest of Commissioner Thompson. She was nodding, her phone still in her hand, but this time she was recording something very different. Today, we're launching a new training program, Sullivan continued. Every officer, from rookies to veterans, will spend time in the communities they serve. Not just patrolling, but listening, learning, understanding. Because that's what happened to me. He looked at the teenagers from the youth program, remembering their stories. I learned that when a 16-year-old boy gets stopped walking home from basketball practice, he's not just scared of getting a ticket. He's scared because his parents have had to teach him exactly what to do if a police officer stops him. Keep your hands visible. Don't make sudden movements. Say yes, sir, or no, sir. The room was completely silent now. Even the veteran officers were paying close attention. I learned that when an elderly woman mentions calling her lawyer during a traffic stop, she might actually be the new police commissioner. A few chuckles rippled through the audience. But more importantly, I learned that it shouldn't matter who she is. Every person deserves to be treated with respect and dignity. Commissioner Thompson stood and walked to the podium. Officer Sullivan will be leading our new community relations training unit, she announced. His experience, both his mistakes and his growth, will help shape the future of our department. She turned to Sullivan. 6 months ago, you made a choice that could have ended your career. Instead, you chose to learn from it, to grow from it, to help others avoid the same mistakes. That's the kind of leadership our department needs. Sullivan looked out at the audience one last time. The badge we wear isn't a shield to hide behind. It's a symbol of public trust. I broke that trust once, but thanks to Commissioner Thompson's guidance and the community's willingness to help me learn, I've worked to rebuild it. After the presentation, people gathered around to talk. The teenagers from the youth program were showing Officer Chen their ideas for the next community mural. Marcus Washington was discussing a new police community basketball league with some of the rookies. As Sullivan packed up his materials, Commissioner Thompson approached him. Well done, Officer Sullivan. Though I have to ask, do you regret that morning when you pulled me over? Sullivan thought for a moment. I regret my actions, Commissioner, but I don't regret where they led me. Sometimes the worst mistakes can lead to the best lessons. She nodded, satisfied. Just remember, the learning never stops. We all have more growing to do. Yes, ma'am, Sullivan replied, watching as more officers joined the discussion about the basketball league. And I'm ready to keep learning.